If you looked at a color photograph of Tokyo in 1945, you would swear it was in black and white. The firebombings had stripped the city of its pigment. The buildings were gray ash, the sky was often gray with smoke, and the people dressed in ragged momped trousers and patched uniforms seemed to have faded into the background of their own destruction. But for the women of Japan, the war had taken more than just color. It had taken their identity. For years, the military government had enforced a strict code of austerity. "Luxury is the enemy," the slogans proclaimed. To curl your hair was considered unpatriotic. To wear a kimono with bright patterns was seen as traitorous. Makeup, perfume, and jewelry were discarded or traded for food long ago. The concept of femininity had been suspended. Women were no longer women. They were simply citizens of the empire, workers in factories, or field nurses on the front lines, expected to be as hard and steel-like as the men. In a makeshift Red Cross hospital set up in a bombed-out elementary school in Osaka, a nurse named Akiko stared into a shard of broken glass propped up against a wall. She was 22 years old, but she didn't recognize the face staring back at her. Her skin was rough and gray from malnutrition and exposure to soot. Her hair was chopped short to prevent lice. Her lips were cracked and pale. She touched her face tentatively. She remembered a time years ago when she would spend hours getting ready for a summer festival applying powder, painting her lips, laughing with her sisters. That life felt like a dream belonging to someone else. Now, her hands smelled of antiseptic and old blood. Her days were filled with the groans of dying soldiers and the cries of orphaned children. There is a specific kind of depression that comes after survival. You survive the bombs, you survive the hunger, but then you look in the mirror and realize you have lost yourself. You have become a machine of survival. Akiko felt hollow. She felt ugly. She felt that the part of her that was a woman had died in the rubble, buried alongside her home. Then the Americans arrived. But this time, it wasn't the soldiers who shocked her. It was the women. A few weeks into the occupation, the first waves of American female personnel began to arrive: Red Cross volunteers, nurses, and administrative officers. When Akiko first saw them walking through the hospital gates, she felt a sudden, sharp pang in her chest. It wasn't fear, it was envy. These American women looked like they had stepped out of a movie screen. They were healthy, their skin glowing with nutrition. Their uniforms were clean and pressed, their hair was styled in soft waves. They walked with a confidence that Akiko hadn't seen in years. But the thing that caught Akiko's eye, the thing that made her stop in her tracks, was the flash of color on their faces. Red, bright, bold, crimson red. The American women were wearing lipstick. In the gray wasteland of 1945 Osaka, that red color was shocking. It was aggressive. It was beautiful. To Akiko, it looked like a symbol of everything Japan had lost: vitality, freedom, and the simple right to be beautiful. She watched them from a distance, pulling her dirty cap lower over her forehead. Hiding her cracked hands behind her back, she felt small. She felt ashamed of her poverty, her dirt, her defeat. She didn't know it yet, but one of those American women had seen her watching. And that American woman understood something that the male generals and politicians did not. That sometimes restoring a nation's soul starts with something as small as a tube of wax. The interaction happened in the sterilizing room, a cramped space smelling of rubbing alcohol and damp concrete. Akiko was scrubbing a tray of surgical instruments, her back turned to the door. She heard the click-clack of hard-soled shoes entering the room. They didn't sound like the soft canvas shoes the Japanese nurses wore. She stiffened, keeping her head down, scrubbing harder. She hoped the American woman would just grab whatever supplies she needed and leave. Akiko didn't want to be looked at. She didn't want to be compared. "Excuse me." The voice was soft, melodic. Akiko froze. She turned around slowly, wiping her wet red hands on her apron. Standing there was one of the American Red Cross officers. Up close, she was even more intimidating. She smelled of soap and powder. Her uniform was crisp, and there, on her lips, was that perfect, defiant shade of red. Akiko bowed low, a reflex of habit. "Yes, ma'am," she whispered in broken English. She expected an order. "Clean this, move that, get out of the way." The American woman didn't give an order. She stepped closer, her eyes scanning Akiko's face. She wasn't looking at the dirt or the fatigue. She was looking at Akiko as a person. The American reached into her handbag. Akiko watched the movement warily. The occupation was still new. Trust was a fragile thing. The woman pulled out a small silver cylinder. It caught the light from the single bulb hanging overhead. It looked like a bullet casing, shiny and metallic. The American woman held it out. Akiko stared at it. She knew what it was, but she couldn't understand why it was being offered to her. In 1945 Japan, a tube of American lipstick was worth a fortune on the black market. You could trade it for bags of rice, for medicine, for fuel. It was a currency of luxury. "For you," the American woman said, smiling. She uncapped the tube. The color seemed to explode in the gray room. It was a rich, creamy crimson. To Akiko, who had spent years looking at rubble, uniforms, and dried blood, the color was almost violent in its vibrancy. It looked like life itself. Akiko shook her head, backing away slightly. "No, no, too much, no." The American woman laughed a warm, easy sound that seemed out of place in a hospital. She stepped forward and gently took Akiko's rough, calloused hand. She pressed the silver tube into Akiko's palm and closed her fingers over it. "It's not too much," the woman said, her eyes serious now. "You're a woman. You deserve to feel like one." Akiko looked down at the silver object in her hand. It felt heavy. It felt cool to the touch. It was a tiny piece of the pre-war world, a fragment of a time when life wasn't just about survival. She looked up, tears stinging her eyes. "Thank you," she choked out. The American woman nodded, patted her arm, and left the room, the click-clack of her heels fading down the hallway. Akiko was alone. Her heart was racing. She turned back to the shard of mirror propped up against the wall. Her hands were trembling so badly she almost dropped the tube. She twisted the base. The red wax rose up. She leaned in close to the mirror. Her breath fogged the glass. She wiped it away. She looked at her pale, cracked lips. Slowly, carefully, she applied the color. The transformation was instant. It didn't change the shape of her face. It didn't erase the dark circles under her eyes. But as she stared at the bright red lips in the reflection, something inside her shifted. The grayness receded. The soldier vanished. The nurse vanished. For the first time in 4 years, Akiko saw Akiko. She pressed her lips together. She turned her head from side to side. A small, shy smile broke across her face. It was the first time she had genuinely smiled at herself in the mirror since the bombs began to fall. She wasn't just a defeated enemy subject anymore. She was a woman who was wearing lipstick. It was a tiny reclamation of power. It was a declaration that, despite the fire, despite the hunger, despite the ruin, she was still here. She was still beautiful. And then she started to cry. She cried not out of sadness, but out of a release of tension she hadn't known she was holding. She cried for the years she had lost. She cried because a stranger from the country that destroyed her city had just given her back a piece of her soul. Later that day, Akiko did something dangerous. She took the lipstick into the nurses' dormitory. One by one, the other nurses gathered around. They touched the silver tube like it was a holy relic. They passed it around, each taking a turn in front of the small mirror. That night, in a dark, cold dormitory in a ruined city, 12 Japanese nurses sat on their cots, giggling like schoolgirls, all wearing the same shade of bright American red. For one night, the war didn't exist. They talked about boys. They talked about festivals. They talked about the future. The lipstick didn't feed them. It didn't rebuild their houses, but it did something arguably just as important. It reminded them that the war was over, and that it was okay to be soft again. It was okay to be human. The lipstick didn't last forever. Shared among 12 women, the small tube was used up within a few weeks, but the feeling it created lasted a lifetime. That small cylinder of red wax became a bridge. Before that day, the American women were seen as the other, wealthy, arrogant victors who had come to rule over the ashes of Japan. But after the lipstick was passed around, the dynamic shifted. The Japanese nurses began to speak to the American volunteers, not with fear, but with curiosity. They started trading stories. The Americans asked about kimonos and tea ceremonies. The Japanese asked about Hollywood and nylon stockings. They realized that beneath the differences in language and wealth, they shared the same fundamental desires to be happy, to be seen, and to feel beautiful. This seemingly trivial exchange of cosmetics was actually part of a massive cultural shift that swept across Japan in the late 1940s. Historians call it the Americanization of Japan, but that term sounds too clinical. On the ground, it was a messy, emotional collision of cultures. As the country rebuilt, The Western style didn't just arrive in the form of democracy or baseball. It arrived in the form of fashion. For the first time in history, Japanese women began to cut their hair in bob styles. They traded their mom trousers for skirts. And the cosmetic industry, which had been decimated during the war, roared back to life heavily influenced by American trends. But for women like Akiko, it wasn't about copying the Americans. It was about freedom. During the war, the government had controlled everything: what they ate, what they thought, and what they wore. The act of putting on lipstick became a quiet symbol of democracy. It was a personal choice. It was a statement that the individual mattered more than the state. Years later, Akiko would tell her granddaughters about the war. She wouldn't talk much about the hunger or the air raids. Those memories were too painful. Instead, she would talk about the angel with red lips. She kept the empty silver tube for the rest of her life. It sat in a small wooden box in her drawer, alongside her most precious possessions. To anyone else, it was just a piece of trash, a scrap of metal. But to Akiko, it was a medal of honor. It was the tool she had used to paint herself back into existence. We often think of humanitarian aid as sacks of rice or boxes of medicine. We prioritize the body, and rightfully so. But we often forget the spirit. War dehumanizes people. It turns them into numbers, targets, and refugees. Peace is the process of rehumanizing them. And sometimes, dignity comes in strange packaging. Sometimes, saving a life means feeding a starving child milk. But other times, saving a life means giving a woman back her smile. The story of the Japanese nurses and the red lipstick teaches us a profound lesson about the nature of recovery. You can rebuild a city with concrete and steel. You can restart an economy with loans and trade deals. But you can only rebuild a broken heart with kindness. That day in the hospital, the American woman didn't just give Akiko a cosmetic product. She gave her permission to hope. She reminded her that the world could still be bright, that it could still be colorful, and that even after the darkest night, there is still room for beauty.